Good day. I'm Stephen Noerper, Senior Director of the Korea Society, and we welcome you to the Korea Society and this fall 2021 season of discussion of policy. We will be discussing today and over the next three first Thursdays a range of pressing security and political issues on and around the Korean Peninsula. Today we start with Harvard University's John Park. John is widely written, is seen widely globally on Korean issues, and really runs a stellar program in directing issues on Korea out of Harvard University in the Belfer Center there. John, welcome. I'd like to also welcome everybody else online. We have a lot of media, we have corporate, and we have various members of the policy community, academe, and our friends at the United Nations. So thank you all for joining. We have about 300 people online today, John, and there will be many more listening and watching via YouTube video and our podcast subsequent to today. So thank you all for joining. Thank you, John. John, today we're going to talk about North Korea Inc. and China. It has been 5 years since you and Jim Walsh of MIT did a great write-up with that title, and we had a successful discussion then that attracted a great deal of interest. And I wanted to talk with you on the 5-year mark of that important report, but also given all of the developments in North Korea-China relations this year. Clearly, we have seen in the wake of the summit meeting between Moon Jae-in and Joe Biden, some comments from China and North Korea, also marking their anniversary of their defense pact. And so trying to get to this idea of whether or not that relationship has fundamentally improved, and what are the implications of that for the US-ROK relationship. John, welcome. And where are we with North Korea Inc. and China today?
Well, thank you so much for having me. And a special note of thanks to you and Jonathan and Tom and the Korea Society. You all were very early supporters of the research that Jim and I did, and very grateful for early opportunities to present key findings at the initial stages and getting great feedback. I think with this, what Jim and I were able to piece together was how North Korea Inc. has evolved and adapted over time. The fact that the North Korean regime has been evading sanctions isn't really the headline here, it's how they were doing it. And so with a phenomenal mentor like Jim, we were able to piece together the mechanisms, the steps through which the North Korean regime was able to engage with private sector actors in China, Southeast Asia, and see the marketplace of ideas turn into a marketplace of very interesting transactions. I think the three key highlights where we're at with North Korea Incorporated. Number one, it's provided a lens to see other phenomena. As you see a very important element of the 1% in North Korea, the regime's apparatus here, you get to see how North Korea Inc. has also adapted, and in many cases has experienced tremendous setbacks because of the policy response that the regime has unleashed in trying to prevent the spread of COVID inside of North Korea. The second area is it provides another lens to look at this evolving North Korea-China relationship through the party-to-party mechanism. There's one thing to note, the political movements, the statements, the visits, but as you see the waxing and waning of North Korea Inc., it does, I think, provide a sense of how this mechanism of development of political relationships and then the monetization of political relationship has continued to play out in the China-North Korea relationship. And then the third key finding that I think still remains with us is that we're looking at the growth of a type of business culture within North Korea that is different from the 99% and the bottom-up marketization of an incredible phenomenon taking place. A lot of setbacks because of the current regime's response to COVID prevention. But in terms of how North Korean officials have essentially transformed themselves into expatriate business people and working in these global marketplaces, it still is an element where the tracking and the research on North Korea Inc. provides ever more insights, I think, in terms of how these areas of growth continue.
John, on that, we've had a really interesting year in the sense that North Korea has essentially been shut down, having pulled down the gates relative to their stated concerns about the pandemic. Yet, and to the point with the economic slowdown, we saw a plenum earlier in the year, and given shakeups in the political leadership, at least some rejiggering of everything come July this year, is there sort of a phenomenon going on where North Korea has essentially locked its economy and is dealing with a real economic necessity, as we've heard from Kim Jong-un and various commentators as well? And how does that figure with their sustainability and their stability?
The stability angle is so crucial. And with this, keep in mind that this is a self-imposed economic crisis in order to achieve the primary goal right now, which is to prevent the spread of the virus within North Korea. So January 2020 is when North Korea announced and very quickly implemented shutdown of all major movements across its borders. And with that type of self-imposed hermetic seal is something that no other sanctions regime, no other sanctions effort had even come close to. And so with that, there is a deliberate action here to induce that economic crisis as a side effect. And so what I think is key in terms of monitoring what North Korea and the regime has been doing is something where with this type of clear prioritization of public health over the economic vitality of different markets and inside North Korea, the vibrancy of economic activity overall, it gives you a clear sight that even with some of the statements coming out, even if we see an endemic type of situation with COVID management around the world, more widespread use of vaccines, more coordinated policies between and among countries, North Korea will still remain shut. And I think it gives you a sense of the recognition from the North Korean side that this is a type of threat that things like advancements and very rapid advancements in 2017 of ballistic and nuclear capabilities, ballistic missile and nuclear capabilities, have zero impact in terms of a policy tool in addressing this challenge. And likewise, the most sophisticated of sanctions evasion techniques also have no bearing in terms of this current challenge. And so North Korea, if you look at the bookends of it, is in a type of situation for all of those policy measures and all of those policy tools that they have optimized and achieved remarkable progress in a short period of time. None of that transfers over in any meaningful way to meet the current challenge.
Well, let's examine that a little bit more, John, in the sense that, does that mean with the nuclear and missile capability that given that economic contraction, you have a higher likelihood of returning to military adventurism? Is it in their interest then to maintain that moratorium? And then let's bring in the China issue, because doesn't that mean, de facto they're more dependent on trade flows at a time when there appears to have been a virtual shutdown at the border?
So there are two interesting phenomena taking place right now. One is North Korea very much focused, and the North Korean leadership very much focused on domestic crises and domestic challenges. So the first is the long list of anecdotal evidence about shortages in North Korea, and really stemming from the decision to seal the border. And as a result, very clearly understanding that it would lead to, in the early phases, 90% cut in trade with China. Latest numbers are about 80% year on year. So you have a type of situation where the shortages were anticipated, and dealing with that combined with natural disasters, floods, challenges on the harvest, a number of fronts where it's an alignment of these different crises at the same time on the domestic side of the ledger. And so if you look at the focus of the North Korean leadership, it is predominantly on these fires, if you will, that have been raging inside of North Korea. This has led to a situation where we have pieced together how China has offered assistance, has offered aid to North Korea, but it's a North Korean regime essentially deciding how much of that to let into the country. And it's been small. The reports about different offers of Chinese assistance piling up at the border. The most recent report about through Gavi, the UN administered program to spread and try to share vaccines, the Sinovacs offer to North Korea being turned down by North Korea. And so on a number of fronts, you see these decisions where for the North Korean regime, it's quite clear that they're looking at the prioritization of these domestic challenges, but also looking at it from the angle that they want, for the vaccine part of it at least, they want to have the effective vaccines. And for them, it's pretty clear which ones those are. Those are the US vaccines. The point about dependence on China, you're absolutely right. You're looking at a situation where if you look at the 2018-2019 period, where the season of summitry, this is the all-time high in terms of how far and how high Kim Jong-un soared in terms of international diplomacy. And then in a very short period of time with the collapse of Hanoi, and then the aftermath of North Korea shutting off relations basically with South Korea and the United States, this ultimate of black swan events with the pandemic. And so from that, the focus on the domestic has led to a situation where through a process of elimination, China is really the only country left. We're piecing together some reports of China providing petroleum products to North Korea. Energy assistance is the top criteria when you look at trying to shore up stability in North Korea. But it looks like there's a barter system in place, and the relationship in that barter system is something that I think is of note and something that merits further investigation. For less refined petroleum products coming in from China, North Korea provided more mineral resources. And so that kind of lopsided nature of it, I think those are the types of arrangements and the types of deals that we're going to see more of going forward.
How do you reconcile, John, some of that reality in refusing, for example, the Sinovac, which was a big story in the media this week, with what's happening at the political level, meaning the statements made after the US-ROK presidential summit about the solidity of China-North Korea relations, marking the anniversary of the Defense Pact and some of the other wordage we've heard out that has been indicative of an improving relationship, whereas it looks like things really seem to be at a halt, as you mentioned, the slowdown in trade flows and that very visible rejection of Sinovac, maybe because of distrust about its efficacy, especially given the effects in places like Indonesia and Mongolia, where it wasn't found resistant, perhaps because they are looking, as you suggest, for real validity in terms of vaccines, but maybe beyond the US, really looking more towards Russia's Sputnik or other types of things, or maybe just being cautious about any vaccination period. So how do you kind of reconcile that high policy level of emphasis versus the reality on the ground of essentially a cutoff in a lot of the exchange?
As we've monitored the various statements coming out of North Korea, two factors come out consistently, and that's emphasis on quality and quantity. On the quality side, as you mentioned, there is concern in terms of the effectiveness, how good is a particular vaccine that's on offer. And in the case of, for the North Korean statements, they're singling out, particularly of AstraZeneca, and the concerns about the side effects. Clearly, they've been monitoring all of the reports out there. And for them, the bottom line is that it has to have that high level of efficacy. And that's really, you're talking about the mRNA, yes. So when you look at it, yes, it's the NRA and basically the United States vaccines that are the ones that are of top choice. But then this leads to questions about quantity. How much can they secure? This is a very delicate type of arrangement in the sense that if you look at how much emphasis the regime has put on the prevention policies, having a widespread vaccination program, in addition to concerns about what kind of monitoring system would be in place and so forth, whatever vaccine would require refrigeration, things along those lines. In addition to those factors, I think there is that critical phase with how many of the North Korean population, what percentage of the population can be vaccinated. Because in order for North Korea to reopen its borders, to have the trade and try to get back to the level or even close to levels that they had before the pandemic, they would need a type of vaccination program that is quite large scale. And in this environment with the widespread nature of the Delta variant, with other countries needing the top end vaccines as well, this isn't something that can be easily prioritized for North Korea alone. So in this environment, North Korea is in that very fragile situation. And it looks like for the time being, they've made the decision that they're not going to go the route of vaccination, that if it is a partial and less effective type of vaccine, that entails more risks than benefits. And they've also pronounced in very clear statements to the North Korean people that vaccines aren't the answer to everything, managing their expectations. So it looks like there will be, for the time being, a continuation of these very, very strict and very harsh prevention measures along the border.
I used a good expression, managing expectations, and it seems that has been something that has been big since the Party Congress in January. And we've heard Kim Jong-un ask the elite to tighten their belts. That has since expanded to appeals to the population to be ready to tighten belts and to be arduous in their pursuit of discipline, applauding youth of late for taking up the mantle of going to do unusual jobs in the countryside, et cetera. Are we seeing that type of belt tightening? And also on the domestic production front, speaking of vaccines, developing their own technology. So the idea, at least the emphasis publicly, is that they're going at their own, right? They're back to the Chuche ideal, but showing their own resistance to the outside. Some might say resiliency. How do you square that with the expectations and the pressures on Kim Jong-un and that administration?
So along those lines, there has been quite a big emphasis on restriction of information getting into North Korea right now, and a big emphasis on how other countries are doing and tackling this particular public health challenge. So I think on that front, there is an effort to try to get everyone on board during this very bleak period and a period that looks like it's going to get worse. And so that focus on working together, the focus on everyone doing their share, this idea that they're going to suffer, but suffer together and they'll get through it. Those messages are quite strong right now. And as you mentioned, with the movement of getting more folks involved with things along the lines of agriculture and trying to get the most out of what meager harvest would be out there, there is a very dire situation playing out on the food shortage angle. One of the key things, though, is that when you look at the movements of goods and peoples, a lot of it had to do with the trade that was happening along the porous border. And so with the sealing of the border, not only do we have the shutting down of the large swaths of trade activity, we also have a shutdown of information. And added to that are the remittance channels that defectors in South Korea were able to send back to their relatives in North Korea. Human couriers who brought in the cash into North Korea and almost dispensed as human ATMs using mobile phones connected to cell towers on the Chinese side, but operating in major border towns on the North Korean side. Those operations are more or less done. And so they have stopped for the moment because the regime has targeted those individuals on the human courier side. And so with that, the flow of information, I think, is a dire one right now, because we're not getting the type of rich information about different market movements, what's happening inside of North Korea in a fairly short period of time, or in real time in some instances. So there's an information gap.
Yeah, and it also seems that information gap, it's related on the ground with the lack of Chinese businessmen, with Chinese truck drivers not wanting to venture across because returning to China means quarantine. And then also, at a different level, our own ability to access information, especially with the departure of so many diplomats and the departure of really the key United Nations workers there, especially the World Food Program. And so our ability to see in has been greatly curtailed. How do you think the Chinese see that? Pivot to Beijing, how are they looking at North Korea? We do have these public pronouncements over the summer. Is that political theater? Are they seeing that they just want to maintain stability and things are cordoned off for now? Or do they have other strategic ambitions or reads?
It seems like there are two streams of messages. One is a very public one, leader to leader. The Chinese leadership, Xi Jinping, very supportive of Kim Jong-un. A lot of emphasis on party-to-party relationship and how that's improving. Every day, that type of fanfare aspect of it. And then I think there's legitimate and very strong concern that you have North Korea that in 2016, 2017 was essentially breaking technological barriers. The capabilities and technologies that they've been working on, and everyone was anticipating North Korea would work on, but the breakthroughs in terms of when they achieved a particular technological threshold, the ICBM tests of July and then November, and then the sixth nuclear test in September that really surpassed the earlier ones. All of that led to North Korea crossing that threshold in terms of capabilities that they still had to test further, but in an area where they're starting to piece together delivering a nuclear warhead with an ICBM. And so when you see it from Beijing's vantage point, you have those capabilities, and then you have domestic instability from these policy measures. First and foremost is the recognition that it isn't a function of COVID spreading throughout North Korea. Rather, it's the very harsh measures and very stringent measures the North Korean regime has prioritized acknowledging that it would damage the economy, but prioritizing the public health goals there. So if you look at it from the Beijing perspective, that sense of a country that had made rapid advancements with its nuclear weapons program, sustaining these long lists of domestic crises, it is a very strong source of concern when it comes to the stability question.
I had a PLA analyst tell me once that the real concern was North Korea's developing long-range capabilities, and that despite public pronouncements, the Chinese were not happy about North Korea doing that. One, for the idea of nuclear mishap or accident, and this had just happened after the fourth nuclear test, and then we saw after the latest, the sixth, in November, in the fall of 2017. Really, a lot of seismic activity in China caused a great deal of concern in the Northeast. And then the idea too that all of this short-range missile enhancement, the other types of enhancements have made for a more fractious region and have raised tensions. And Chinese don't like that. I mean, one, for their own internal reasons, and two, because it draws the Americans in closer. So how do you think they see this relative to the strategic part? If they see North Korea as having to manage all of these economic downturns, the food shortfall, the natural disaster, and being closed relative to the pandemic, and then yet, advancements on the military front, short of agreements, which remind us we need to be at the table talking with them about denuclearization and lots of other issues. How do the Chinese see this relative to their role, relative to their concerns, and where they place the value on North Korea relative to the peninsula and regional relations?
So I think there's been remarkable consistency from the Chinese side in their messaging that for them, there is no standalone North Korea policy, no standalone South Korea policy, that it is in the context of Korean Peninsular strategy. And what the Chinese are trying to advance is stability. And so that has been very consistent in their statements over the years. But as it plays out right now, there is concern about the North Korean factor, that what happened in 2017 is something that the Chinese were very concerned about, to the point where they signed up for and they implemented the reduction of the flow of petroleum products into North Korea with a clear message. This is something that the Chinese they want to see North Korea stop these type of testing capabilities that raise the temperature on the Korean Peninsula that we hadn't seen, for decades. And so the key finding, though, from that time period is during that time, the Trump administration essentially, put pressure on China to go all the way. If you're going to reduce the flow of petroleum products, this is the moment to get North Korea really to the bargaining table. China shut off all the petroleum products. And China said no. And I think the message was pretty clear that they're not going to trigger inadvertent collapse of the North Korean regime. So they will go to a certain extent, but the fact that they announced that they're not going to jeopardize the stability of the North Korean regime, I think was an important message for the North Korean regime as well, the extent to which China would go even on their economic pressure side. The second aspect of what China's been doing, I think, has been very consistent in trying to elevate this dual freeze that they've been strong proponents with Russia on, where in exchange for the United States and North Korea not doing the large scale type of military exercises, North Korea would essentially suspend their nuclear and long range missile tests. And we've seen kind of a de facto type of dual freeze persist, but the Chinese definitely would like to see the addition building up on that. And there was a hope that we could see something like that during that season of summitry. So you can imagine in Beijing, as they monitor the roller coaster, the heights of summitry in 2017, 2018, 2019, and where we're at right now, this is a dramatic fall in terms of the situation. And how China can help is also muted again, because here North Korea is essentially controlling how much of Chinese assistance is coming into North Korea because of the concern about contamination and spread.
Thanks. I'd ask any of our viewers, if you have questions, please send them to policy@koreasociety.org. And in about 5 minutes, we'll turn to those questions with Jonathan Corrado, my colleague there. John, let's pivot from Beijing to Seoul in Washington. What are the implications for North Korea, Inc. and China now for the US-ROK relationship, And then independently, are there other concerns that the Blue House and the Seoul administration have relative to this and their strategy toward North Korea and the region? And how do the Americans see that relative to their difficulties with China and the balance there in trying to establish some stability in the situation?
There was a lot of optimism with the restarting of the hotline between the military hotline between North Korea and South Korea. But with the announcement of US-ROK military exercises even toned down preceding, we essentially have seen that hotline go cold again. Daily communications that were a normal part of operations have ceased. But the other area that I think is crucial to monitor is the reports from the International Atomic Energy Agency that from their estimates and from their calculations, Yongbyon, North Korea's crown of their nuclear jewel, their program, was detected. The IAEA had essentially detected activity, and the agency is basically saying that there was the type of violation from their perspective of previous agreements related to the operation of Yongbyon. That is now at the center point, I think, of how various countries are viewing North Korea. And right now, that's a delicate area for the US and South Korea to navigate to how much they're going to focus on this piece. But with respect to the overall picture of where things are at, specifically through the lens of North Korea Incorporated, this is something that North Korea Inc. has been very muted. If you look at the situation inside of North Korea, I think you get a sense of, again, sort of the domestic priorities. All of their issues right now are secondary. And that, I think, gives a sense of the urgency of the moment. But I would just highlight one specific example here. You see from the regime a message to elite military troops that they have shoot to kill orders on the border area to secure that border. And then you have other elements of the North Korean regime giving the order to elite North Korean state trading companies that essentially make up North Korea Incorporated to do more business activity, to try to generate the type of revenue or procurement of important items. And that puts those two elements in direct contrast to each other, because there is an external component to what they are essentially asking the state trading companies to do. So I think you're seeing a lot of these tactical orders that are coming out that give you a sense of how dire the situation is domestically, but how these type of conflicts on the tactical orders aren't going to be easily resolved.
Let's mention two specifics that have been in the media of late. One, the US-ROK military exercises, and some would say the expression of Kim Yo-jong and the North Koreans was strong. Others would say they were rather reserved or rather muted in terms of the pronouncements around the joint exercises. And also, we've had a test by South Korea of a submarine launch ballistic missile technology, a serious upgrade in capabilities that show an increasingly autonomous capability for South Korea. How does that fit into the mix of where China and North Korea see themselves?
I think from the Chinese perspective, the statements are pretty clear. They're very concerned overall by these type of developments. First, the extension of the missile guidelines that came out of the Biden-Moon summit. And then now, as you mentioned, the submarine launched ballistic missile and the maiden test of it, and something that South Korea is rightfully very proud of in terms of technological advancement. But in terms of these new capabilities, there is a concern from Beijing that it's upsetting the military balance in the region. From a North Korean perspective, this is something that for those who view this as an opportunity, the elements within North Korea, this is a great pretext, I think, in terms of ratcheting up the defensive and responsive nature of North Korea's program now. This provides a great justification on that front. And for others, I think there's a legitimate concern that in the alliance dynamic, these are South Korean capabilities. These are our South Korean policy directions that add a type of robustness that really wasn't there before. And so what the legitimate concerns are from the North Korean side as it plays out in terms of a new facet that's building up. It's been there in the past, and there have been plans on the books for a while, but the fact that they're playing out in such a short period of time, the source of concern and how this will play out in North Korea, that's another shoe to drop. And I think we'll likely to see that kind of response in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, the concerns are real in there. John Park, thank you. Let me turn to Jonathan Corrado of the Korea Society, who will go ahead and field some of the questions from our very distinguished audience today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stephen Noerper, Dr. John Park. A very rich and insightful discussion. I think from smart people, you learn what to think, and from wise people, you learn how to think. And this is the kind of conversation that gets those juices flowing. So we have a tremendous amount of questions from our audience, which is fantastic, lots of interest. And I'll start with a news-driven one about Yongbyon. So Haejun So from Radio Free Asia asks, North Korea recently held its September military parade, and prior to that, it resumed activities at the Yongbyon nuclear reactor. What kind of message does this send to China, the US, and the international community? So I think we could ask, is this more of an internal need-driven development? Just North Korea needs more fissile material, or is there some element of signaling to the restart of Yongbyon?
I think signaling is a great way to view it. And this is something where I do see consistency. If you look at the big announcements coming out of the post-Hanoi summit period, North Korea, Kim Jong-un was very explicit in saying we have no other alternative now but to essentially ramp up and build out our nuclear weapons program. And also the long shadow of Hanoi is, one element was what North Korea and what Kim Jong-un put on the table, essentially dismantling of the Yongbyon nuclear complex, what the North Koreans view as the crown in the nuclear weapons program jewel. The jewel in that crown is something that the US side said that, in return for the dismantling of Yongbyon, lifting 5 of the 11 United Nations Security Council sanctions resolutions is not a good deal. And so from a North Korean perspective, I think the message was pretty clear that they need to show that Yongbyon and the nuclear weapons program is worth it. And so I think the building out aspect of it was fairly consistent, and the activities at Yongbyon would fall in line with that perspective. But the overall context, the picture here is one of North Korea maintaining very consistently on that front. But also, if you look at the military parade and the photos that have been coming out, again, there's a domestic focus. You have a large number of North Korean military personnel in hazmat suits, almost kind of like a first responder, the sense that the regime and the military have this challenge under control, this domestic threat from the potential spread of COVID. I think that kind of messaging was more for the domestic audience in that sense. But there was a difference from this particular military parade from previous ones.
Very interesting. But let's turn to one that we just got freshly from Professor Sig Hecker. And he wants to know what we should do. What can the US do in this current moment? So he asks, what can the Biden administration do to help Kim Jong-un deal with the domestic challenges that we've been talking about throughout this discussion? And what are the chances that Kim will respond to those?
My thanks to Professor Hecker for his question. I think we can thread the needle here. If you look at a remarkable group within the Biden administration, you have individuals who have been proponents of essentially vaccine diplomacy. If the effort to get vaccines to North Korea is framed in a larger global context, and I think one from a public health perspective makes a lot of sense. You don't want to have pockets of outbreaks that produce variants. We've seen and we're experiencing now the Delta variant in terms of how we're trying to all adjust to it. So there is something that goes beyond the decades-long nuclear issue and the security challenges to something that is fundamental and globally oriented. Threading the needle here is to make North Korea part of a larger campaign as opposed to singling out North Korea and somehow linking it to progress with denuclearization talks. I think that should be the top priority. And in doing that, there could be indirect side benefits in terms of opening up potential channels. But I do think the first priority in this particular moment would be looking at ways to get the type of vaccines online for North Korea as a part of the broader strategy, because we now are detecting, as our public health officials are saying, variants that are following Delta as well. So this is an area that I think is possible. The messaging is something that's distinct and that is outside of the area where there's gridlock, and we haven't seen much progress with North Korea so focused domestically. And so I would give this type of focus, this type of area, the type of connecting of the dots as a unique opportunity right now.
Yeah, it's so important the way that these messages are conveyed, giving the North Koreans an opportunity to save face on the international stage, so crucial. Let's turn now to a question from James Milt from New York University. James asks, how worried is China about North Korea regime collapse? And this is something that you alluded to before. And if I could add something on top of that, there have been some efforts by the US to have conversations with China about dealing with the contingency on the peninsula in ways that would mitigate risk. We've seen China very reluctant to have those types of conversations with the United States. Do you see that changing anytime soon? So the double question, how worried is China about North Korea collapse, and chances for the US and China to talk about responding to a contingency in a way that doesn't spiral out of control?
So thanks for the question. And I think one way that we've pieced together and the picture that we see as Beijing tries to manage and handle the challenges coming from the Korean Peninsula, in particular for North Korea in this instance, it's almost as if North Korea is viewed as an instability variable, and how the North Korean variable in this instance is a focus of the Chinese applying different policy tools. One of the things about China growing in its economic and security power is essentially they have more tools to address this instability variable. And so over time, I think there was a view that China could interact in a way that they had these tools, they were able to combine them themselves and also in coordination with other countries. And a management of this instability variable was seen as an area where they're showing up more effectiveness. And then COVID happens and the pandemic, and what North Korea is doing by way of undermining in many respects advancements in how China had been managing these type of situations as well. Very similar to how North Korea advancing its own nuclear weapons program and its sanctions evasion techniques have very little carryover in terms of addressing this challenge. Really, the only alternative for the North Korean regime, as they've decided, is to continue to seal the border and hunker down in terms of what is essentially going to be a very long winter when it comes to dealing with this COVID challenge. Similarly, from the Chinese perspective, providing assistance, providing aid, a lot of those type of channels, and they're redundant ones, North Korea is the one that's saying right now. So I can only imagine how anxious Chinese leaders are with the self-imposed economic crisis worsening. And this is one of the reasons why I think China reaching out to South Korea and trying to coordinate more with South Korea. Foreign Minister Wang Yi, in terms of the types of coordination with his South Korean counterpart, I think is a sign that China is trying to make those kind of movements. But as we've seen in the aftermath of Hanoi, with North Korea shutting down relations with South Korea, even that kind of coordination is going to have modest, prospects at this current stage. So I think this kind of anxiety inside of Beijing is only going to grow.
We got a question from Ed Baker from Harvard Korea Institute about THAAD. What are the implications and what's the current status there? I know that Harvard Korea Center did a fantastic program earlier in the summer that I got a chance to check out with the two co-commanders of the CFC, and there's so much rich discussion going on there. So I guess the question would be, how much does the impact of THAAD still impact the way that China, South Korea, the US are thinking about their security posture there? And has this been reconciled? I see there's still conversation this week with the South Koreans and the Chinese about informal sanctions on South Korean media products in China. So what's going on with that? What kind of lessons are there still to be learned?
Thank you, Ed, for that question. And the event that we had with General Brooks and General Lim, the commander and deputy commander of the Combined Forces Command in South Korea, I think was very insightful in the sense that we had two key architects of a policy response during that time period where that issue was playing out, providing their take on how they were diagnosing the situation, how they were addressing it. And so from that, I think there's rich insight. I would add a different angle to that analysis, and that's from the lens of economic statecraft. To take Ed's question and approach it from a slightly different angle, this is an example with the THAAD case of one way to do a comparative analysis of how the United States and China conducts economic statecraft, and particularly economic coercion. I think it's salient because, number one, as we see US-China tensions rising in relations, at this critical juncture getting worse, the implications in terms of how the economic coercion playbook is developed and how it's implemented is quite stark. If you look at it from the US perspective, there's a big focus on sanctions, the rule of law, coordinating with government and private sector to making sure that the overall architecture is in place in preventing, trying to curtail a particular actor in doing a prescribed type of activity. It is a methodical, it is a very intricate process. And with that, you are restructuring different ways of interaction among countries, within countries as well. What that shows us is that from the Chinese approach, it wasn't really the type of rule of law economic sanctions approach. It was almost like economic disciplining as the Chinese book played out. So to give example, Lotte Group is the South Korean conglomerate where the Ministry of National Defense in South Korea had the real estate deal. The golf course became the site of the THAAD battery. And as we've seen it play out during that episode, Lotte Group interest predominantly in the shopping mall industry and sector in China started to have these safety inspections, other things that curtailed and shut down their business to the point that Lotte Group in their shopping mall business had to exit the Chinese marketplace. Other South Korean businesses also sustained major declines in sales during that time period. And also Chinese tourism to South Korea declined as well. So adding to the event that we hosted looking at the THAAD period, the economic statecraft component of it, I think reveals some interesting patterns that I think we're going to see going forward. Because from the Chinese perspective on the economic disciplining side, they can turn it on and turn it off in a very seamless fashion. Whereas building up all of the architecture required to advance sanctions require a tremendous amount of unwinding when there's a political settlement, as we've seen with the previous Iran nuclear deal. And so that's a juxtaposition, and I think sets a context in evaluating episodes like the THAAD case and others that are likely to emerge.
That's a great point, and it leads to these larger questions about what South Korea's economic posture is going to be in the short-term future. And this is related to a question that we get from Thomas Yu from Willow River Capital Management. Thomas asks, will the trends support the need for more South Korean institutional investors to further diversify their assets into the US and other ally countries? So are we going to see South Korean investors moving away from China and towards other countries? And then we could also pile on to this questions about supply chain resilience. We saw that come up in the Moon-Biden summit, questions about semiconductors. South Korea is once again in the middle of things because their biggest export is chips and their biggest customer is China. And so there's a little bit of a dependency situation going on from both sides. So just wondering how the lingering impact of that and the way that it sent a message, a shot across the bow almost. It is going to change the way that South Koreans, investors and on a national level evaluate risk in engaging economically with China.
Thanks to Thomas for that question. I would take it from a slightly different angle. I think there are areas in which South Korean companies were concerned about this type of economic disciplining coming out of China. But the two trends that I think really highlight how South Korea, in this instance, serves as kind of an oracle of global trends. There had been talk about the necessity of diversifying supply chains, especially as US-China competition deepens and in areas there are strong worries about the direction that's headed. But the fact that you see South Korea with its southern policy and very comprehensive engagement of Vietnam as a foothold in Southeast Asia and that kind of diversification that's happening, I see it less as an alternative to China, but rather diversification of supply chains that make South Korean companies more potent in terms of how they're able to interact with the region. So again, more tools that they can use in this playbook of global and diversified supply chain, something that other countries and other companies have talked about. South Korea is already a few steps ahead of that. The second trend is, if you look at the major South Korean conglomerates, the chaebols are coming into the United States and doing types of technology acquisitions that really talk about how they are prioritizing AI, robotics, the type of technology driven economic advancements that they see as a big part of the fourth industrial revolution. And that also has a kind of a compendium in terms of what the Chaebol are doing inside of China as well. The big players on the South Korean side have been moving into the technology space in China too, because of this focus. And it's a very, very specific focus on making sure that they're not a part of the wave, that they're leading the wave in the fourth industrial revolution. So as much as we hear a lot about the security challenges on the Korean Peninsula, these two drivers of South Korea's southern policy, as well as the Chaebol in the private sector, diversifying and making huge inroads in the US marketplace when it comes to technology, I think are again, examples of how South Korea in this instance serves as an oracle of global trends.
Fascinating. And now we're going to pivot to China's role in Korean peace and denuclearization. Can it play a constructive role? Will it play a spoiler role? And I'll group together two questions here. The first is from Howard Lee Kilby from the Arkansas Haiku Society, which is so lovely, the Arkansas Haiku Society. Would the PRC agree to a peace treaty to replace the 1953 Armistice Agreement? They were a signatory there, so they would have to agree to some sort of end of war declaration. So what's China's approach to a peace treaty? What sort of conditions is it looking at on that? And then Gus Olson from Agribusiness Intelligence is asking, what could and should China do to prevent North Korea from exporting nuclear bomb expertise and material? So does China have any role to play in terms of non-proliferation? So peace treaty, non-proliferation, how is China approaching those two subjects?
Terrific. My thanks to Howard and Gus for those questions. The focus on a peace treaty, on political reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula, this is a big part of the Chinese game plan for the Korean Peninsula and something that they support in principle. And so if you look at it from that angle of unification goals, peace, prosperity, stability, those are all things that China very much likes, because that has the connotations of longer term stability on the Korean Peninsula, an area that isn't really seen as a foreign issue, but something that's very, very close to home. If you look at the border region, proximity to Bohai, this is something that as a major foreign policy security challenge would hit very close to capital Beijing. But the conditions under which those goals would be achieved are the areas that make it unlikely. It's not a black or white type of situation, a binary. It's really, I think, a probability type of analysis. It is unlikely that we'll see the type of conditions that Beijing would like to see. One is that it would be a longer process, that Beijing would be consulted closely throughout that process. It is something that would be done transparently. All of these things, given the nature of the region, is unlikely to play out. Yet I think that formula remains kind of the bedrock in terms of how China would like to see a more longer term stability play out on the Korean Peninsula. And ultimately a peace treaty would be a part of it, but the conditions under which that would play out, I think you start to see the cleavage in terms of how other countries are looking at a peace treaty. With Gus's question, looking at China's stance on proliferation concerns, I think those are very real. And that is from the angle of, if you see an actor like North Korea export nuclear technology, nuclear components to other countries, there's just a concern that that's going to invite greater instability in other regions as well. And so China, certainly is going to be very vigilant about that, but the extent to which they would act to stop it, it's unlikely we're going to see anything dramatic. Even in the implementation of sanctions, that's something that in the first period, there may be some movements towards that. But I think the track record that we've seen from China is that even in instances where North Korea, in terms of what they've done proliferation-wise, vertical proliferation, as they've improved their nuclear weapons program inside of North Korea, even in those instances where China was a co-author of UN Security Council resolutions condemning and also putting together sanctions against those measures, when it came to the longer term implementation side, there was always question marks in terms of how much China was, to what extent China was implementing those sanctions.
Great. Now we have a couple of questions about Russia's role on the Korean Peninsula denuclearization peace process. So, of course, Russia and China joined together in proposing this freeze for freeze proposal. And we've seen heightened cooperation, but we still have some underlying sort of suspicions about just how deep this strategic cooperation is. So, Stephen, I know that this is an area of your expertise as well, so please chime in. So the two questions are, so Gio Gong from Columbia University asks, does North Korea's history with Russia, former Soviet Union, provide leverage in its relationship with China? So it's old Cold War strategy of playing two sides against the middle. Is there still room for North Korea to do that today, or are China and Russia relatively close together when it comes to this issue? And then Jae-bum Kim from Royal Asiatic Society, Korea, asked a really interesting question. Could Russia go into North Korea and do industrial and tourist cooperation in return for some progress in denuclearization? So we normally think about China playing that role or South Korea playing that role, but could Russia do that? So any thoughts related to either of these questions from Jae-bum Kim, Jiho Gong, or just in general, what's Russia's role here?
Sure. A quick response, then I'll turn it over to Steve there. But the two factors that come to mind, one is if you look at the level of Russia-North Korea economic interactions, trade statistics, things along those lines, they are very much overshadowed in pre-pandemic times. The diversity as well as the scale of China-North Korea trade. And the factors that I think are at play, one is when you look at what North Korea needs and what they're trying to prioritize, what they're optimizing for, it's not really present in the Russian marketplace. One way to view the Chinese marketplace is that it's not really a national economy, it's a global economy. If you look at all the major international players who have set up operations in China, not the old playbook of trying to lock in, cheap labor and then, sell goods to different types of target markets and lock in the savings from cheaper labor. Those days are long gone. They're developing a massive foothold in China because they see the growth of the Chinese national economy as a big area for their, continued growth as well. Their longevity and their profitability in the years to come after sinking a lot of investment into that marketplace. And so with that, when North Korea goes into the Chinese marketplace, procuring different types of items from dual use components to things that are more sensitive nature is pretty straightforward. And I think that's the key finding from the research that Jim and I did looking at the adaptation and the evolution of North Korean activities in this marketplace. This isn't a dedicated government type of program or party to party or government to government between North Korea and China. These are North Korean procurement agents, fancy way of saying expatriate business people doing business in a globalized marketplace. The second factor is when there have been instances of North Korea-Russia deals, either pipelines or railroads or anything of those natures, we've kind of seen Chinese actors and players elbowing out the Russian competition. And the way that has been effective among many different practices, but one is a Chinese actor basically telling a North Korean counterpart, if you move forward with this particular Russian deal, then this other more lucrative, larger scale deal that you have with us or one of our counterparts, that could come into jeopardy. And so you see the North Korean side either mothballing, freezing, or walking away from some of these deals. So I think the sharp elbows of some of these Chinese commercial actors is another reason why we haven't seen the type of larger level economic commercial activity that would be commensurate to the type of political affinity between Russia and North Korea.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, sure. Let me just add very quickly that I think that the nuance John provides is really important. Too often we're grouping China and Russia together relative to the idea of state contest here, and that we're playing the United States and South Korea off some complex of North Korea, China, and Russia. In fact, there is a lot of strategic cooperation, but also a strategic contest between and among them, right? Things are not as close as some of our Cold War stereotypes pretend them to be. So I think what we need to be doing is thinking creatively, right, about how the different regional actors can contribute. And so if we look at Russia for its offerings or China for its offerings, is there potential for progress in terms of trying to talk with the North Koreans about issues of nuclear safety? Can they, enjoying the confidence they do, talk about nuclear doctrine, strategic doctrine, very important issues of demilitarization and dismantlement over time. And those are the kind of things, as well as what was mentioned earlier in the program about contingency planning in the event of unfortunate downturns in nuclear safety or political instability in North Korea. So that kind of preparedness, but also remembering at the end of the day that North Korea presents a tremendous developmental challenge. And as much as we're concerned about the very real security prospects, we also need to be concerned about the greatest development project in Northeast Asia, and that will be North Korea, and that will take a concentration and cooperation of activity between and among South Korea, the United States, China, Russia, and Japan to add. Jonathan, did you have one last question you wanted to pose to John from our audience before I wrap up?
Absolutely. Thanks, Stephen. Fascinating. So this one is about cyber. So it's from June Park, Dr. June Park at George Washington University. And June asks, how can we address North Korea's cyber hacking? Is there more that the US and South Korea can be doing together to try to address this challenge?
Well, thanks to June for that question. And June has been doing fantastic research in this area. I think one of the areas where there is a great need for a lot of good work to be done because it's rapidly evolving. I look at it from one of, it's awkward to say it this way, but one of the silver linings of the pandemic for some of the North Korean actors is with the migration very rapidly of the world to e-commerce and doing things on the internet, there are just more pickings for North Korean cyber actors. And so from that lens, we've seen a dramatic increase. CrowdStrike came out with a report and they ballpark it as a 60% increase in terms of these type of cyber crimes. I do believe that when it comes to these type of actors, as we've seen with the Colonial Pipeline, where these were non-state actors, these were hacker groups that were operating essentially in Russia and carrying out these type of operations, it's a type of very murky interaction of the various actors that makes it very difficult in terms of how to address these type of issues. In the case of the Colonial Pipeline, I think as a case study, it's fascinating because you saw the president of the United States essentially threatening the president of Russia that if these type of measures, if these type of cyber operations continue, there would be consequences. But when you carry out, what are we going to do in this type of response space? I think it's still evolving. And when it comes to North Korea, it is changing, but you see North Korea doing a lot of their activities from IP addresses outside of North Korea. One interesting angle of North Korea-Russia cooperation is the Russians connected a second broadband pipeline to North Korea, the other one being a Chinese one, Huawei. So you're looking at the growth of this type of activity inside of North Korea, but it's still at a fairly low level compared to what they're doing abroad. So the two main things for me, number one is that when it comes to how we respond to this, North Korea still is a type of target where how do you respond to a country that is not carrying out these activities from their sovereign areas. It's not inside of North Korea, this is outside. And then the second is the challenges of attribution. I think those are enduring and very complex. You're never going to get 100% attribution that this particular cyber actor did it. There may be patterns, there may be malware signatures that are similar that give a high degree or a medium degree of confidence that it is a North Korean group. And so it is a murky area. And I think because of its murkiness, this is almost ideal for some of these North Korean cyber operating groups.
John, thank you. And Jonathan Corrado, thank you as well. I'd like to thank you, John, for really rich insight over the last hour, and you've given us a very rich tapestry with which to work. And also congratulations on the 5-year anniversary of that very important report that you and Jim Walsh from MIT produced. I'd also like to note, every time we talk, John, I also think about one of our great mentors, Ambassador Steve Bosworth, who I know meant a great deal to you and to our friends there at Harvard University, as well as to the Korea Society and our broader field. So I know conversations like these honor his memory. I'd like to thank all of those who joined us today and presented questions, whether from the media, corporate, policy, or academe. And it's just such a joy to have questions coming from people like Ed Baker, and the Yenching Institute made a great deal of importance to me when I was a Fletcher student back in the 1980s, and recall classes there fondly. And I also am very grateful to Sig Hecker at Stanford University, given their important work. And we do have Shinji Wook from Stanford University, who will be with us on October 7th for our next first Thursday policy discussion. Thank you to the Korea Foundation for supporting these First Thursday initiatives and all of our good policy work, as well as to our other funders. And thank you to Jonathan Corrado of our staff, as well as to Peter Stemke from our tech division and Claire Callahan from communications. Thank you all for joining. And John Park, thank you. We really have enjoyed this discussion. It's always a pleasure and an honor. And thank you for sharing your thoughts today. Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks so much.